Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to present the 2009 Benjamin Franklin Award to Professor Philip D. Bourne.
Hello, or should I say, g'day. So, it's a great pleasure to be here, and thank you very much for this award. Certainly, what I do is due to many, many people, and so I'm really accepting this on behalf of lots of people I interact with in the open access space. I was actually free to talk about whatever I like today, which was kind of nice, but then I decided that I won't talk about my science, which is pretty much in pharmacology, and actually Leiji will be talking about our off-targeting work tomorrow at 11, so it's a little plug for him while we're getting set up. What I would like to talk to you about is a little about some things that I believe are important and are happening in the world of open science. And actually, interestingly, Jeff put up the same comment as I already extracted from the work of Benjamin Franklin. And I won't repeat it here, but it's clearly enormously important. However, I will say that one has to also be realistic about these things. And there has to be a business model associated with any kind of open science. But I think there are lots of opportunities to create new business models around this without compromising the idea of having free flow of information. Hopefully that will become a little apparent as I go through this. So I'm just going to give you one person's view of what I see are the emerging possibilities that will probably be realized in the next several years. And of course, I acknowledge straight away that talk is cheap and action expensive, and I will sort of highlight at least some actions that we ourselves are taking. But I think there could be a lot more action by a lot more people to take advantage of what we have already. Of course, again, Benjamin Franklin said this much better in the sense that well done is better than well said. So let's just look at this from the context of the academic workflow. Here's a nice scientist sitting in the middle of this diagram here. And essentially, what we do is we basically start research by developing grants. And for those of you who are asleep right now, I'm assuming it's not because of what I'm saying, it's because yesterday you responded to the stimulus and you put in a whole series of research grants. What must have been one of the most maddening processes I can ever imagine. Supposedly, in the first round of the stimulus package, there are going to be 200 grants awarded. I estimate myself that it's probably 5,000 to 10,000 have been submitted. So it's a hard slog, as many of us know. But out of that comes some results. And that's often presented first as a poster session, later as conference papers, and then, of course, journal articles, and the cycle continues. Nothing strange there to people. There are different parties that are part of this contract at different parts of the process. So the feds give you the money, the societies deal with posters and conferences, the publishers deal with the journal articles. And this is not, of course, you can swap this around a little, but this is sort of basically what happens. But what's happening now, which I think is very stimulating and very different, is the idea that our academic output, our scholarly output, is actually taking on new and interesting forms. Yes, we've been reviewers, we've done reviews, we very rarely get any recognition for doing a good review of a paper or a grant or anything else. That's been going on. But the idea of curation, the idea of community service in blogging and wikis and so on, these are things that are happening more and more. They're very important to the fabric of science, yet they're really unidentified and underrepresented, and in my view, certainly not rewarded in the way they should. So that's one observation I'd like to make. The second one is that there's, and I've never quite understood this, but is the notion that the whole scholarly process ends at a certain point. You produce a manuscript. That manuscript is then effectively thrown over a wall to the publisher, at which point, essentially, that your part of the process as author finishes. And at that point, it's handed off to a publisher, and you probably don't even think about it again once it's published. Now, maybe there is a different type of cooperativity between the publisher and the author that could actually go on, rather than essentially throwing the paper over a wall. So the take-home messages I would make from this workflow are the idea that there are different products arising from that workflow. They're certainly valued very differently. Clearly, you don't get tenure for writing a blog posting or submitting data to a database. You get it for publishing the kind of papers we just heard about. But the important thing is that what I see is a slight change. I'm in a very conservative, essentially experimental department, and they never really valued data very much that was deposited in public repositories. But I think it's fair to say that that is beginning to change. There's this notion now that because they are now avid users of this data, that it's important. It's in a public resource, it's important it's curated, and it's important that it can be retrieved successfully and its quality can be estimated. So this is something that's changing. So the publication, as I already said, this is another way of saying it, it's sort of like a baton in a relay race. You hand it over to the next runner, and then you sort of collapse and forget about it. Well, maybe there's different opportunities on the horizon. And then only we are aware of our scholarly output. That only we can actually aggregate, organise, etc., everything we know, because there is no single organisational person that does that for us. And I would argue, at least in my case, again quoting Benjamin Franklin, that I'm beginning now to forget the things that I've done. And so, in some senses, a lot of these things can be lost. So how can we actually retain more of our scholarly output? So I'll get to that in a second, but I think what's important is there are signs of change on the horizon. So basically we've had this very clear distinction between, let's just call it knowledge and data. Now clearly that's merging. Traditional journals, more and more over the last few years, the amount of supplemental information, often the primary data associated with the study, appearing in that publication. To the point now where essentially in 5 to 10 years we've gone essentially no supplemental information, to now the bulk of the information about the paper is actually in the supplemental information. At the same time, on the database world, we have more and more data being collected, obviously, as we just heard, but also there's curation of that data. And often that curation, I've just come from a biocurators meeting, they just formed a society of people, many of whom spend a lot of their time extracting knowledge from the literature and putting it into a database. Somehow, at great expense and great value, but somehow this seems a bit silly to me. So what we're actually slowly moving towards is this grey area where we're going to have something in the middle that's sort of a hybrid between the database and the journal. And there are signs of this. I wrote about this in 2005, and it sort of got a lot of feedback and a lot of energy is associated with this kind of idea. So I just want to introduce to you one way in which that could actually be manifest. It happens to be something that we're doing because I happen to be interested quite a lot in structure-function relationships. And if you look at a structure-function relationship as it's described in a journal article, it is possibly the worst way to, well, not the worst, but certainly not the best way to actually describe and understand and comprehend what is going on. So, for example, let me just illustrate that with an example. So, think of a static PDF versus what I'm actually going to describe to you. So, in step one, you come with an online article. And then it's typical, there's a thumbnail in that article. And basically, you actually click on that thumbnail, it brings up a nice picture, in this case, the open book form of protein kinase, I'm sure close to the hearts of a number of people in this room. Trying to understand the functional aspects of that from the structure can be quite difficult. So why not just click on that structure and basically bring up a representation that's very similar to what's in the figure, but something that's annotated and it can also be rendered and manipulated in a three-dimensional way. So, this is actually not that hard to do, and in fact all you need is a piece of metadata deposited with the article that describes the view and where to go and get the data, for example, as a web service call to the Protein Data Bank, which I'm also involved in. So once you bring that up, now you have a different annotated view. So you have a different view, effectively, on the data associated with that paper. There are annotations on this. So, for example, The annotation could relate to the glycine-rich loop that overlays the ATP when it binds to the kinase. When you click on that, that takes you to another view, as in 3 here, where you now have a mashup. You have a composite view of information that's taken from the database and a variety of literature articles associated that happen to reference in some way and describe a glycine-rich loop. That then provokes a further field of inquiry, which then takes you back to another journal article, and so the cycle continues. So it seems to me that this is actually, there's no really whiz-bang new technology to do this. It's basically there today. It just requires a new contract, particularly between author and publisher and database, to make something like this happen. So there are further signs of change. I should say that elements of what I've just described will actually be available through the Protein Databank. So you can have a database view onto the literature, or you can start with the literature and you'll have a database view from the literature. And both of these things, at least in my small world of structure-function relationships, is not very far away. What are the other signs of change? Well, we heard from Jeff that the first lending library came from Benjamin Franklin, and at the same time, we've had lots of movements, and of course I have to say I'm a big fan of PLOS, where there's just a modern day new kind of freely accessible lending library, if you like. Associated with these kinds of new libraries are a contract that exists in the form of an agreement, an open access or Creative Commons license in this case. And the thing that's amazing to me is that there is an element of this contract, this license, that basically means that you can use the content of a journal article, and it's marked up to some degree in an XML form, which can already be used and manipulated. And I'd say at this point, very little of that is actually going on. There's a few aficionados, some of whom are here, who are trying to use this content, but it's not being used very widely. Now, in part, of course, that at the present time, there isn't that much of it, say, in Pubmed Central. And what is there, I have to say, is not marked up consistently by publishers who really have a vested interest in making sure it is marked up consistently. But notwithstanding, we can do things with it. I mean, right now, there is only about, I don't know, 50 to 100,000 articles in Pubmed Central in this form. However, that's changing very quickly with open access initiatives as supported by the NIH and others, of course. So, right, the 50,000 papers that are being indexed by Pubmed each month, very many of those are soon going to be going into expanding this corpus. So we have a lot of new opportunity to actually use that content. I'll just give you again a couple of examples of how that can be done with respect to the work that we're doing, in this case with Scivi.tv. So basically, this is a mashup of open access journal content and rich media. In this case, it happens to be a video of the author talking about their paper. Those two are synchronized together, and you do this online when you upload the information. And that gives you actually quite a rich learning experience. Again, think about structure-function relationships, which I do all the time. A really powerful way that I think we're beginning to see through this kind of site is to capture the enthusiasm and the knowledge of the author talking about that particular paper. And as they talk about different features, the features of that, the tables, the figures, all pop to life, and you can actually really see what the author's talking about. On the other hand, you might want the view of just reading the paper as you would normally. You do that on the screen. You get to a certain point, and you're not quite sure what the author's trying to tell you. Well, basically, you click on the paper, and up pops the author and starts telling you specifically about that particular aspect of the paper. So, these are just experiments, in essence. I mean, there's lots of caveats associated with this, and I'd be welcome to deal with them offline, but I'm just trying to get you across the principle. Another aspect is the idea of post-markup of a paper. So I think virtually no author who submits an open access paper fully realizes what they're signing up to. That I can actually take their paper and essentially republish it and actually enhance it in certain ways. I mean, certainly, I don't want to get slaughtered, so I don't take this very far. But I think this idea of adding semantic enrichment to these kinds of papers that can actually be done either by the author or in a post-processing way based on things that have already been published. So here's an example of this. So here's a figure in a paper, and basically as you mouse over that figure, it makes a web service call to appropriate databases and pulls up data that's associated with that figure. And at that point, you can, so you basically got an enrichment and allows you to explore that figure in new and meaningful ways. At the same time, when the paper was processed, it actually generates a whole set of references that are within that paper that highlight database references and ontological terms. So if you're interested in tracing things through the gene ontology, you immediately see what gene ontology terms are actually present in the paper. You can click on them and take you directly to that point of the paper. So these are just little examples of where we're starting to go with this. So where do we go from here? As I said, only we are aware of our scholarly output. And in fact, I recently wrote an editorial about this as well. I'm not a scientist, I'm a number, which actually got, I have to say, quite a lot of pushback. But basically, I find it important, and here's why. And some of you may even recognize this book. It's a book I actually wrote, some of you older people knew it. It's actually a book I wrote in 1990, and about transitioning between the VMS and the Unix operating system, which is something that many of us did way back then. And a tear comes to my eye even now when I come to Boston and think of Digital Equipment Corporation. I have a very, oh, I'm getting teary already. Okay. So many people asked me when this book came out, did I write the Bourne shell? And I say, no, there's no way, I'm not smart enough. Steve Bourne wrote the Bourne shell. But I couldn't be truly disambiguated. If I had $1 for every person who said that to me, I'd be a rich person. Of course, the aspect of disambiguation becomes even more important just in the journal articles. Okay, this person has a different initial to me, but basically, he actually works in structural biology, so there's quite a lot of overlap. So I want Bourne identity. I want to be identified uniquely within this space, the online cyberspace where a lot of my scholarly output arises. So I would say that this is unavoidable. That this idea of having a unique identifier, which in one sense you can think of as a DOI for people, is absolutely going to happen. For those of you who know The Prisoner, and in these kinds of audiences I actually find quite a lot of people know about The Prisoner, so he was fighting constantly to say, I am not a number, I am a real person. And the pushback always was, whatever you say, number 6. So basically, I think this is essentially inevitable, it's going to happen to us. But how this is going to be done is by no means clear yet. There are lots of players in the space. There's OpenID. I was just talking to David Lippman recently. The NCBI is working on my bibliography, which will provide disambiguation to authors as they appear within Pubmed and Pubmed Central. Thomson Reuters is doing Researcher ID. Elsevier is doing Scopus ID. And Crosstrek itself is responsible for DOIs. Is doing something that's name changes almost every day, but the last time I heard it was called Crosstrek. So it's not clear who's going to win this battle, but in the end it doesn't really, it's sort of a progression in my mind. If there are a series of these, ultimately they will coalesce and we will have this identifier. What it means that every piece of output I produce, whether it be a posting on a blog, whether it be data that goes into a database, will be associated with this unique identifier and therefore be retrievable and could in principle be authenticated. And there's a whole series of businesses, I think, around this notion. You can argue with this, I'll be happy to. But think just how it might work with respect to authors. And I think publishers have a role to implement this scheme sooner rather than later. So every time you actually go to publish, basically you don't have one already, such an ID will be assigned to you and then maintained as a singular ID across your scholarly output at the time that you actually submit the paper. So this actually then creates a new kind of relationship between the publisher and the author. And I think that kind of relationship is actually going to expand dramatically over the next few years. So I can actually see a time when the publisher is much, much more than the end receiver of this product. So basically I see that the research product will be different, relationship will be different, and you can think of the publisher, or whatever we're going to call them, as a warehouse for the workflow of scientific endeavour, not just the repository of the end product. So the moment I'm standing in the shower, I have an idea and I write it down afterwards. In principle, that could actually then already be put in the hands of a publisher. Obviously, there'll be some sort of access control list that is going to actually define who has access to that information at any time point. But at that point, I can then begin to share it with people in my lab, say, that idea coalesces into a series of experiments. Parts of that data may be private, part public, but it could be contained by an entity that actually maintains that information as I go along. And so, of course, the whole process continues through this workflow, and it is retained and coalesced and made more accessible, perhaps, than it is today. Just a trivial example is I cannot even get all of the slide presentations that people in my own lab make because we don't essentially keep all that in a centralized way. So maybe we're starting to see these kinds of things emerge as central repositories for our scholarly output. It seems to be a natural progression. So the evidence, I would say, that these things are coming to fruition is the notion of things like portals and hubs, as in tradition publishers are using for these terms, which actually coalesce information much different, much more than the conventional publication. That they have commentary, they may even have the reviews in an open review system, which is obviously an interesting notion. And I think the evidence is we're starting to see companies emerge, organisations emerge, which are trying to do this kind of thing. So ResearchGate and Orbit are examples of early stage emerging possibilities. There are a number of others. So to me, this is in essence the future. So in summary then, I just call it the Bourne ultimatum, which is perhaps a bit overstatement. I would encourage you, I would encourage open science obviously, but with the realisation that someone has to pay for it, but I think there are lots of opportunities while still making all the information openly accessible. And then I would ask you, I would call upon you, and I'm using this as a sort of pulpit I suppose, to support the notion of a user ID of some kind, and to support the notion of new contracts between authors and publishers. So thank you very much, and I'd just like to acknowledge the people in my group who basically essentially allow me to come and give these kinds of talks while they're doing all the real work. Thank you very much.
We do have time for one or two quick questions before we break for the exhibit hall. Anyone with a quick question?
I have many questions. I have 100 questions. In this new model, one thing I'm fearful, you see lots of people publishing lots of papers, and this whole mode of it's not over once you submit, you see it really slowing people down, right? Because now your time commitment to respond to things people might say about your paper, if it's open review, you're having to have those kinds of debates, and how is that going to change sort of that dynamic of you're not going to want to publish 10 papers or 20 papers a year because it's too much work as follow-up. And would that inhibit or help the state of scientific knowledge?
Well, I think you're making a very good point, and if I use the context of the pubcast that I showed you, which was the merging of the rich media with the paper, who's going to do that? Okay, what we found is that we thought everybody says this is a great idea, but when it comes to that paper being published, by the time it's published, it's lamentably you're 6 months down the line doing something else. Are you going to go back and make a video about that paper? What we find is not very often. On the other hand, what we do know is when you actually do it, access to your paper actually goes way up. The one I showed you actually sort of broke all statistics associated, which you usually see. So usually you see these kinds of distributions where you publish a paper, a lot of activity around it, drops off, long tail. Hopefully the tail's at least got some height to it. What we saw here was this paper when 2 years into it, the number of downloads and accesses was actually higher than when it first came out. So that may or may not be some incentive. Frankly, I think in this case, that kind of thing won't work. However, what it did do was call into another idea, which was actually to do the same thing with posters. And that's actually turned out to be much more successful, because a lot of people don't want their poster on the web, and they don't want to be seen talking about their poster, because it's, it's work in progress. Other people love that idea, and it takes what was, a 2-minute, or sorry, 1 to 2 day presentation. It now makes it persistent and allows that work to persist for a longer period of time. So, new ideas emerge from things that don't work. So, but you've made a good point, and I think it's open to question where a lot of this will go. But I still see it as an exciting time with lots of new possibilities.
One thing that you didn't mention and might be important would be to have the authors actually extract the main conclusions from their paper in something like a triple story as part of the publication process, because that would make everything much more immediately available to the scientific community who uses computers to analyze it.
So again, there's two sides to this. So what I know from my work with PLOS, where we actually require an author summary, is that often authors are essentially incapable of doing this at some It's actually incredible, is that what you get is so it's essentially a more generally accessible summary of the paper. Often it's actually even more complicated than the abstract of the paper itself. But so there is that sort of issue. But I think again, for this to happen, and I'd love to see it happen, I think it's an excellent idea, but it has to be easy, and it has to be part of that workflow. So there's some talks about this kind of thing here, but we and other people have actually developed plugins to Word to facilitate this kind of activity as you're writing the paper. So in our case, we've actually built tools that allow you to do semantic enrichment, and along the lines that I showed you, but rather than us post-process the paper, it's actually done by the author, much more controlled, presumably much more accurate. So the idea that that is extended to include these kinds of summaries would be, a wonderful thing. And again, I think that sort of thing happening requires you as authors and you as publishers to get together and basically agree to do that.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bourne.